summer holidays had arrived and, with them, the long-awaited tranquility. All my flatmates had left for their respective cities, leaving me alone in our spacious university apartment. The solitude was welcome at first, providing a break from the intense studies and frenetic campus routine. The first nights were peaceful. I spent my time watching movies, playing video games, and enjoying the freedom of not having a fixed schedule. However, after a few days, I started to notice something strange. Late at night, when the city was already silent, I heard the sounds of footsteps in the apartment hallway. It was as if someone was walking from one side to the other. Initially, I thought it was my imagination or the old building creaking, but the sounds continued. One night, after hearing those footsteps once again, I decided to check it out. I got up carefully, trying not to make any noise, and went to my bedroom door. I peeked through the peephole in the hallway, but didn't see anything. I opened the door and looked around, but the hallway was empty, lit only by the dim light of night lamps. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the feeling of being watched grew every day. A certain discomfort, an invisible presence, seemed to follow me throughout the apartment. The last straw came one night when I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth before bed. In the mirror, a message written in shaky, steam-smeared letters stared back at me. "I'm watching you." Shock washed over me, cold running down my spine. I ran into the hallway, but again, there was no one. What was happening in my apartment? Was it someone's bad joke? Or was there something more sinister lurking? After that night, nothing felt normal anymore. I spent my days in a constant state of vigilance, trying to ignore the persistent goosebumps on the back of my neck. The silence in the apartment that was once comforting now became suffocating. The sounds of footsteps continued, but I didn't dare investigate any further. Something inside me knew I wasn't alone, even if I couldn't prove it. One morning, as I opened the refrigerator to prepare my breakfast, I noticed that some of my provisions were disappearing. It wasn't just one or two items, but a significant amount of food. I tried to remember if I had eaten more than I thought, but the disappearances continued. I closed the refrigerator with a growing feeling of despair and confusion. I started locking my bedroom door at night, but that didn't bring relief. Things got worse when I started hearing whispered conversations coming from the ventilation ducts. It was always at night, when the silence amplified every little sound. I lay in bed, covered up to my chin, listening to those indistinct voices that seemed to be discussing something. I tried to capture words, but it was impossible. I felt surrounded by shadows, voices, and an invisible presence. One morning, while tidying up the living room, I found a necklace on the floor. It wasn't mine, and I knew it didn't belong to any of my roommates. It was a simple but ancient object with a worn pendant. I lifted it, feeling a chill down my spine. Who could have left that there? The question was pounding in my mind, without an answer. My fear grew every day, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I decided I needed to find out what was going on, even though the truth was terrifying. I decided to investigate the ventilation ducts, where the voices were coming from. I grabbed a flashlight and began exploring, moving slowly around the apartment, listening for every little sound. As I opened the main duct grill in the living room, I felt a draft of cold air. I illuminated the interior and carefully crept inside. The space was cramped and dark, the air heavy with the smell of dust and damp. The flashlight's light flickered as it advanced, revealing the interior of the ducts. I found clear signs that someone had been there: dirty handprints, food debris, and what looked like a path worn from constant use. Fear was embedded in my chest, but I needed to know. I continued to crawl through the ducts until I reached an opening that led to a small hidden space within the walls of the building. What I saw there made my heart almost stop. It was a makeshift room with an old mattress, worn-out clothes, and various personal belongings scattered around. There were photos, letters, and objects that indicated that someone had lived there for a long time. My body was shaking. Whoever it was living in the shadows, lurking, stealing food, and whispering in the night. I felt sick thinking about how I had been watched and manipulated. I was about to leave that claustrophobic nightmare when I heard footsteps approaching quickly. Terrified, I turned off the flashlight and hid in the darkest corner of the small room, barely breathing. The footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor of ducts, getting closer and closer. I could hear my own breathing quicken, trying not to make any noise. The unknown person entered the hidden room, his shadow cast by the dim light he brought. I stood still, watching through the dim light. It was a man, unkempt in appearance, his eyes fixed on the small space that seemed to be his home. The terror I felt was overwhelming. I needed to get out of there, but any movement could give me away. The man seemed busy with his own thoughts, fiddling with some objects. I took the opportunity and began to slowly crawl out of the room towards the duct corridor. But in my nervousness, I ended up bumping into an empty can that rolled across the floor, producing a deafening noise. The man turned quickly, his eyes wide with shock and anger. I knew I only had seconds before he caught me. With a desperate rush of adrenaline, I began to crawl faster, hearing the footsteps of the man behind me. He was shouting something, but I didn't understand the words, my heart pounding in my ears. I managed to get out of the ducts and ran to my apartment door, locking it behind me. I took out my cell phone and, with the hands trembling, I called the police, explaining the situation in a confused and terrified way. The wait for the police was endless, but eventually, they arrived. When they opened the small hidden room, they found the man still there, hiding in the shadows. The investigation revealed that he was a former tenant who had never left the building. He hid from the new residents, living in the ducts and forgotten spaces between the walls, stealing food and watching everyone who passed by. The revelation was shocking and disturbing. I couldn't live there anymore, knowing what had happened. I moved out immediately, vowing never to rent an apartment alone again. The experience left me with deep scars, and to this day, I can't ignore a strange noise at night or the feeling of being watched. The terror I experienced in that apartment still haunts me, a constant reminder that sometimes danger can be closer than we imagine. That night, the storm raged outside with uncontrollable fury, the thunder reverberating off the walls of my isolated house on the outskirts of town. I've always liked solitude, the silence it brings, but that night something seemed different, as if nature itself wanted to warn me that something sinister was about to happen. The lights began to flicker, casting dancing shadows across the walls of my room. I was used to power outages during storms, so I didn't worry right away. That's when my phone vibrated on the bedside table, breaking the momentary silence. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I'm here." A chill ran down my spine. Who could be sending me this message? I looked around, feeling the loneliness of the house more intensely than ever. The lights flickered once more before going out completely, plunging everything into suffocating darkness. The only sound was the wind howling outside, while the rain tapped against the windows like fingers trying to get in. I got up, feeling around in the dark until I found the candles I always kept for emergencies. The flickering light of the flames brought a modicum of comfort, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I looked at my cell phone, now without signal. Fear was beginning to seep in, squeezing my chest like a growing addiction. I was alone, or so I thought, With the candles lit, the house took on a gloomy air. The shadows seemed to dance to the rhythm of the flames. I stood still for a moment, listening only to the sound of the storm outside, trying to calm my racing heart. It was then that I heard the first noise. Coming from downstairs was a low, dragging sound, as if someone was moving something heavy across the floor. The sound froze me. The air felt thicker and every beat of my heart echoed in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the irrational fear that was taking over me. I picked up the cell phone again, hoping that the signal had returned, but there was nothing. No bars, no connection, just me trapped in the darkness. I decided I needed to check it out. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe an open window would let the wind move the furniture. I grabbed a candle and walked down the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my feet, increasing my anxiety. When I reached the end of the stairs, I noticed something that made me even more apprehensive. The front door was ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I always locked all the doors before going to sleep. An icy chill ran down my spine as I noticed wet footprints on the floor. They weren't mine. Soggy boot prints stretched from the foyer to the living room, disappearing into the shadows. With my heart racing, I followed the footprints, each step taking me deeper into the abyss of the unknown. I got to the living room, and that's when I heard it. Whispers, low, distant laughter, as if someone was having fun at my expense. The sounds came from all sides, filling the air with an invisible, oppressive presence. The candle flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadowy figure in the shadows. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt paralyzed with fear. I was trapped in the nightmare of my own home, not knowing who or what was there with me. With the candle almost going out, I decided I needed to hide. I ran to one of the upstairs bedrooms, locking the door behind me. The small candle flame was my only solace, dimly illuminating the space around me. I picked up a kitchen knife that I had brought with me, holding it in shaking hands, trying to convince myself that I could defend myself if necessary. The noises coming from below intensified. Now they sounded like heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, getting closer and closer, more and more threatening. My breathing was rapid and shallow, my heart hammered in my chest. Then the door handle began to slowly turn, producing a sound that chilled me to the bone. It seemed like time had stopped. The door was pushed hard, but I resisted, pushing it back with all my strength. Suddenly, the door opened violently. I held the knife tighter, ready to face whatever appeared on the other side. But there was no one. The hallway was empty, only darkness stretching out before me. The candlelight flickered once more before going out completely, plunging everything into complete darkness. I stood still, listening to my own labored breathing, trying to understand what was happening. The whispers and laughter had stopped, but the feeling of an evil presence remained. Minutes felt like hours until suddenly the electricity came back on. Light flooded the room, illuminating every corner, but it brought no comfort. The house was silent, a silence so profound that it seemed impossible that anything had happened. I walked down the stairs cautiously, each step a test of my newfound courage. The front door was closed, locked, as if it had never been opened. The wet footprints disappeared. I picked up my cell phone, and this time there was a signal. I called the police, trying to explain the unexplainable. They arrived quickly, but found no one, nothing out of the ordinary. Just me, shaking and in shock. That night left marks on me that would never be erased. The house, which was once my refuge, turned into a place of terror. I could no longer bear the thought of spending another night alone there. I decided to move away, leave that place and the dark memories it contained behind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wet footprints, heard the whispers, and felt the presence I could never see. Today, as the storm begins to roar and the lights flicker, I remember that night and how something as simple as a text message can turn someone's life into a nightmare. I will never know who or what was in that house with me, but the knowledge that something was there is enough to keep me away from any place where the darkness might hide its secrets. I decided that weekend would be the perfect opportunity to finally relax. My parents were going away and the house would be mine alone. The freedom was a welcome relief after intense weeks of studying. That first night, I curled up on the couch with a stack of movies and a big bowl of popcorn, enjoying the peace and quiet. The house where I lived was old, built at the beginning of the last century. Its corridors were long and narrow, full of wooden doors that creaked at the slightest touch. The attic in particular had always given me an uncomfortable feeling, but until then, I had never given it much thought. As night fell, the wind began to blow stronger, making the tree branches scratch the windows. While watching my third movie, a muffled sound caught my attention. It seemed to be coming from the attic, a dry noise, as if something had moved up there. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly tried to calm down, rationalizing that it could just be an animal that had snuck inside. I got up from the couch and walked slowly to the stairs that led to the attic. The door was closed, as always. I stood there for a few seconds, listening for any other sounds. The silence was absolute, except for the beating of my heart. It must just be my imagination, I thought, returning to the living room, but that uncomfortable feeling wouldn't leave me. Every creak in the house seemed amplified, and I began to notice details that had never bothered me before. The sound of the wind passing through the cracks in the windows, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and even the sound of my own breathing. Everything seemed louder, more present. I decided to ignore it, focusing on the films. However, the idea that something might be in the attic continued to haunt my mind. I looked at the clock and saw that it was already past midnight. Sleep was beginning to weigh heavily on my eyelids, and I decided it was time to go to bed. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each step creak beneath my feet. The light in the hallway seemed dim, barely enough to ward off the shadows that gathered in the corners. When I passed the attic door, I hesitated again, but exhaustion overcame fear and I went straight to my room. Before going to sleep, I locked the bedroom door, something I rarely did. As I lay down, I tried to push away thoughts of the attic and convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that night would be different. There was something in that house, something I didn't yet understand, but it was certainly about to reveal itself. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, as if I was being watched. The room was plunged in darkness, except for the faint moonlight that came through the window. I lay still for a few seconds, trying to listen for any sound, but everything was silent. I took a deep breath and tried to go back to sleep, but the restlessness wouldn't leave me. The next day, when I went down to the kitchen, I noticed that some things were out of place. The kettle, which had always been on the stove, was now on the table. My books, which I had left piled in the corner of the room, were scattered across the floor. I was confused, but again I tried to rationalize. Maybe I moved things myself and forgot. As the day went on, the feeling of being watched intensified. With every step I took around the house, I felt a pair of invisible eyes following my movements. Objects continued to move mysteriously. The remote control I left on the coffee table appeared in the bathroom. My keys, which were always on the hook next to the door, were found in the kitchen. All of this started to make me nervous, but I still tried to remain calm. It was then that I found the photo. She was lying on the living room table, on top of a pile of papers. It was an old black and white photo of a family I had never seen before. The image showed a couple with two young children, all staring at the camera with serious expressions. The clothing and style of the photo indicated that it was taken many decades ago. The photo disturbed me. I didn't know where it had come from or how it had gotten there. I searched the entire house, trying to find any clues, but I found nothing. That feeling of being watched became even stronger. Every shadow in the house seemed to hide something, every noise a harbinger of danger. That night, while I was sitting on the couch, the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the room, making my heart race. I answered quickly, but there was only silence on the other end of the line. "Hello?" he said, but no one responded. The call was interrupted shortly afterwards, leaving me even more upset. From then on, things started to get worse. The shadows I saw moving through the hallways became more frequent. Sometimes I could have sworn I saw human silhouettes, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. One night, as I was heading to the bathroom, I saw a dark figure at the end of the hallway. I stopped, frozen with fear, but when I blinked, she disappeared. I locked all the doors and windows, hoping to keep whatever it was out of my house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't something outside that haunted me. The presence was with me inside the house. The tension was unbearable, and the constant fear of being caught off guard left me exhausted. The nights became a real torment. I slept poorly, waking up at every sound or movement. My mind was on the verge of collapse, always on alert, expecting the worst. Something was wrong in that house, something I couldn't understand or explain. And I knew that, sooner or later, I would have to face this. The longest and most terrifying night began with a disturbing dream. I was trapped in the attic, surrounded by shadows that whispered my name. I woke up panting, with the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The clock said 3 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night. I got up from the bed with a shiver running down my spine. The house was plunged into absolute silence, a silence that seemed full of dark expectations. I walked to the bedroom door and slowly opened it, the creaking of the hinges echoing down the hallway. Down below, the darkness seemed even thicker. I walked down the stairs carefully, each step feeling like a challenge to my nerves. When I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed that the attic door was ajar. My heart raced. I was sure I had locked all the doors before going to sleep. I approached the door with flashlight in hand, the flickering light illuminating the dust-covered walls. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, revealing the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The darkness seemed to swallow the light from the lantern, and a musty, antique smell filled the air. I climbed the steps slowly, each step echoing in the cramped space. When I reached the top, the flashlight light revealed the interior of the attic. Old boxes and furniture covered in sheets were scattered around the room. But what caught my attention was a large old mirror leaning against the back wall. I approached the mirror with a growing sense of dread. The surface was dusty, but I could see my reflection clearly. It was then that I noticed something terrifying. A dark figure was moving behind me in the reflection. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I looked in the mirror again, and the figure was still there, now closer. It looked like a woman, her face covered in shadows, her eyes shining sinisterly. A scream formed in my throat, but fear paralyzed me. The figure raised its hand, as if wanting to touch me through the glass. In a desperate act, I picked up a piece of wood that was on the floor and threw it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening sound, fragments scattering throughout the attic. The figure disappeared at the same moment, and silence took over the environment again. The strange phenomena stopped after the mirror was destroyed. The house, once filled with an oppressive presence, seemed to have returned to normal. I came down from the attic, my heart still racing, and sat in the living room, trying to understand what had happened. The next morning, with daylight bringing some comfort, I began to investigate the photo I had found. Searching the local library, I discovered that the family in the photo had lived in my house decades ago. They all mysteriously disappeared, and the case was never solved. The mirror in the attic seemed to be the key to everything. Maybe he had trapped something, a part of that family's dark history. With the mirror broken, the figure disappeared, and the phenomena ceased. But the feeling of restlessness remained, a constant reminder of what I had experienced. I was never alone in that house again. The terror of that night left a deep mark on me, an experience that could never be forgotten. The old house, with its dark corridors and dark secrets, has become a place of haunted memories. And I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I could never truly escape what I experienced there. I have always been passionate about photography. Capturing moments, expressions, and the beauty of everyday life was my form of art. That night, I was alone at home, immersed in editing a new series of portraits I had recently taken. My small apartment was silent except for the gentle hum of my computer and the occasional mouse click. Hours passed unnoticed as I adjusted lights and shadows on the screen. The stillness was broken by a subtle, almost imperceptible sound coming from the kitchen. A light scratching on the window, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I looked at the clock, realizing it was already past midnight. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe a tree hitting the glass. But the sound seemed more deliberate, like a calling. I stood up slowly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The house was cast in shadow, and every step I took seemed to echo in an eerie silence. When I reached the kitchen, I hesitated before pulling back the window curtain. The street outside was deserted, lit only by a solitary street lamp that cast a pale, flickering light. It was then that I saw it. Stuck outside the window was a small piece of paper. I carefully opened the window and took the note. My fingers trembled slightly as I unrolled it. The words, written in a slanted, irregular hand, were simple but carried an unsettling weight. You are being watched. I felt a cold on the back of my neck and my heart raced. I looked around, trying to spot any signs of movement, but everything seemed normal. I quickly closed the window and checked the doors, making sure they were locked. I returned to my chair, but the comfort of routine was gone. The message kept echoing in my mind. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a bad joke, a bored neighbor or a naughty child trying to scare me. But even with these explanations, the feeling of being watched did not disappear. That note seemed to be just the beginning of something much darker and more disturbing. Over the next few days, the tranquility of my apartment was replaced by a constant feeling of restlessness. Every noise, every shadow seemed charged with hidden intentions. I tried hard to maintain my routine, but the memory of that note wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to ignore it, but I soon realized it wouldn't be that simple. Objects in my house started moving around without any logical explanation. A book that I always left on the coffee table appeared on the shelf. My keys, always hanging next to the door, were now found in different places in the kitchen, on the couch, even in the bathroom. Every time I found something out of place, I felt a chill run up my spine. The tickets continued to appear, always in unexpected places. I found one inside the fridge, another on the bathroom mirror, and even one stuck to my computer screen. The messages were brief but disturbing. Do you remember? I'm closer than you think. Sarah. The familiarity of my name written by an unknown hand filled me with indescribable terror. The culmination of this string of notes came when I found one that mentioned a strange name. She always knew. The note was signed by someone named N. That name meant nothing to me, but the implication that this person knew details of my life was frightening. The feeling of being watched intensified. I started avoiding being alone at home for long periods of time. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, looking for any sign of intrusion. Sleeping became a challenge, and the few hours of sleep I did get were plagued by nightmares. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to install security cameras around the house. I placed them at strategic points, hoping to catch whoever was responsible for this invasion of privacy. Cameras became my new obsession. I reviewed the recordings every day, looking for any sign of suspicious movement. For the first few nights, the recordings showed nothing more than normal. The house was silent and empty, and I was beginning to doubt my sanity. Maybe it was all in my head, but this false sense of security was brutally interrupted when, one night, while reviewing the images, I saw something that froze my blood. A hooded figure moved silently through the house while I slept. The person seemed to know exactly where the cameras were positioned, avoiding showing their face at any cost. My heart sank as I saw her standing in front of my bedroom door, watching for a few minutes before disappearing back into the darkness. The sight of that hooded figure invaded my thoughts, transforming fear into absolute panic. The idea that someone was inside my house while I was sleeping was unbearable. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. Hesitantly, I opened the message and almost dropped my phone. The message contained a photo of me, taken inside my own home. It was a photo of me sleeping. My heart beat faster as I tried to process what was happening. Soon, other messages followed, each with a different photo of me working on the computer, cooking, even taking a shower. Each image was a testament that someone was constantly watching me. In a state of desperation, I began locking myself in my room every night. I would push furniture against the door, trying to create a physical barrier between myself and any intruder. The nights were long and filled with anxiety. Every little sound in the house seemed amplified by the silence of the night. It was on one of these nights, while I was locked in my room, that I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. The steps were slow, deliberate, and closer. The sound echoed down the hall, and I knew the hooded figure was back. I tried to control my breathing as I moved silently to the bed, my phone clutched in my shaking hands. The footsteps stopped outside my room. Then a dull knock hit the door, followed by another. The figure was trying to enter. With hands shaking, I called the police, my voice barely breaking out into desperate whispers as I explained the situation. The knocks on the door continued, each one louder than the last. When the police finally arrived, the house was plunged into dead silence. The hooded figure had disappeared, leaving only the echo of the knocks on the door and the overwhelming feeling of panic. The police searched every corner of the house, but they found no one but me. I was in shock, barely able to believe what had happened. Officers reviewed camera recordings. The images showed the hooded figure moving around the house, but suddenly, it simply disappeared, as if it had never been there. There was no logical explanation for what I saw. The feeling of helplessness and vulnerability was overwhelming. The dark presence that had haunted my home disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. The police found no trace of the hooded figure, no sign of a break-in or invasion. I was alone in the house, except for the lingering feeling that something terrible was yet to come. With the help of the police, I reinforced the security of my home by installing alarm systems and additional locks. But the feeling of security was only illusory. The nights were marked by fear, and the anxiety never left me. I decided I could no longer live in that house, surrounded by such distressing memories. I packed my things and moved to a new place, hoping to leave behind the terror that had haunted me. Yet even now, in a new environment, the fear persists. Sometimes at night, when I'm home alone, I feel the same shadowy presence, as if something is watching me from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever be able to escape this feeling, if I'll ever be able to feel safe in my own home again. The experience changed something inside me. The innocence of security has been replaced by the shadow of paranoia. Now, every shadow, every movement, is a constant reminder of the night my world was invaded by the unknown. And worst of all, the feeling that perhaps the nightmare is not over, that the real terror is yet to come. That Friday, as I said goodbye to my husband at the door, little did I know that the lonely weekend that followed would be the most terrifying of my life. I am Jessica, a young teacher who, as fate would have it, had a penchant for suspense stories. However, the experience I was about to live in our old colonial home would go far beyond fiction. After making sure that all the doors were locked, I finally decided to explore the attic, a corner of the house that we always avoided. I climbed the narrow, creaky stairs, feeling a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The air in the attic was heavy, thick with the dust of years and the smell of aged wood. Rummaging through old boxes and sheet-covered furniture, my eyes fixed on an aged photograph. The photo portrayed a family of 4, a smiling couple and 2 children, a boy and a girl, both with mischievous looks. What perplexed me was the background of the image. There was no doubt. It was our home. I turned the photo over, revealing a hand-scribbled note. "I'm back," it said, in uneven and unsettling letters. I felt a chill run down my spine. That simple piece of paper threw me into an abyss of unrest. Who were those people? Why was the photo in our attic? And, most importantly, what did "I'm back" mean? I tried to push these thoughts away, convincing myself it was nothing more than a coincidence. I came down from the attic, but the feeling of being watched persisted. During dinner, alone in the kitchen, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the windows made me more alert. The disturbing note was still on my mind, but I tried to distract myself with a book. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. Night fell and the house fell into an uneasy silence. I fell asleep on the living room sofa, still disturbed by the photograph. I was awakened by an unexpected sound, children's laughter. I sat up suddenly, my heart racing. The laughter seemed to echo through the hall, light and playful, but completely out of place. After all, I was alone. I stood up slowly, my bare feet sinking into the soft carpet as I walked toward the hallway. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of small, quick footsteps. I went to the front door and looked out the window into the backyard. The shadows of children running across the lawn left me astonished. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself that it was just a play of lights and my imagination. But outside, the silhouettes moved so real that it was impossible to deny what my eyes saw. The next morning, I decided to explore the house for any sign that would explain the previous night's events. In the attic, I found old toys scattered across the floor. Porcelain dolls with faded eyes, metal cars, and a rocking horse that creaked softly as I approached. I didn't recognize any of those toys. I had never seen them before. Each object seemed imbued with a forgotten history, and I felt like an intruder in an unknown past. Night fell again, and once again the unsettling sounds began. Laughter, footsteps running down the hallway, and the occasional sound of furniture being dragged. I felt a chill run down my spine when I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the figure of a child standing at the end of the hallway. It was a girl with long dark hair, wearing an old dress. I called out to her, but the child ran away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I ran after her, but found nothing but sepulchral silence. In the days that followed, paranormal activity in the house intensified. I decided to investigate the history of the house. I spent hours at the local library and online archives until I finally found what I was looking for. The family in the photo, who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago.
No clues, no traces.
They just disappeared, leaving behind a house full of secrets. As I delved deeper into the story, events in the house became more disturbing. I started receiving phone calls from an unknown number. On the other end of the line, a childish voice whispered, "Come play with me." I installed security cameras in a desperate effort to capture any evidence of the children I saw and heard. However, the recordings only showed an unsettling emptiness, as if those entities were invisible to modern technology. The culmination came one night when the noises from the attic became unbearable. Arming myself with a flashlight and uncertain courage, I decided to go up to investigate. When I opened the attic door, I found a group of children watching me. Their pale figures and empty eyes glowed in the dim light. Before I could react, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone and terrified. Suddenly, the attic door closed with a bang, locking me inside. The sound of approaching footsteps made my heart beat faster. I was paralyzed, waiting for the worst, not knowing if I would get out of that cursed house alive. Locked in the attic, the air seemed to grow heavier by the second. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, the beam of light flickering through the shadows. The sound of footsteps came closer, closer and closer, until it seemed to resonate right next to me. I felt an icy chill on the back of my neck and an invisible presence watching me. I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm, but fear dominated me. Desperately, I looked for a way to get out, but the door seemed supernaturally locked, with no key or mechanism holding it. I took out my cell phone and, with shaking hands, dialed the emergency number. My voice came out in a choked whisper as I called for help, explaining that I was trapped in the attic of my own home and that something unexplainable was happening. As I waited for the police to arrive, the footsteps became more frantic, running around me in an invisible circle. I began to hear whispers, indistinct words that seemed to come from all directions. I closed my eyes and huddled in a corner, wishing I was anywhere else. After an eternity, I heard police sirens. Minutes later, heavy footsteps came up the stairs and the attic door was broken down. Several police officers entered, their flashlights illuminating the attic as they helped me out. The feeling of relief was immense, but the fear was still present, latent, like a shadow that refused to go away. Officers investigated the attic and the house, finding signs that someone had recently lived there. Folded blankets, leftover food and toys arranged as if they were still being used. However, there was no clue about the children I had seen and heard. It was as if they had never existed, except in my terrified memories. When my husband returned from his trip, I reported everything that had happened. The terror in my eyes was enough to convince him that we needed to move immediately. We agreed to sell the house and look for a new home, away from that disturbing shadow that seemed to inhabit every corner of the house. As we packed our things, I couldn't help but think about the photo I'd found. Before leaving, I went up to the attic one last time. The photograph was still there, and as I picked it up, I felt a strange connection to those missing children. As a silent farewell, I left the photo where I found it, hoping that those restless spirits would find the peace they were searching for. Our new home brought immediate relief. The nights were peaceful, without ghostly laughter or unsettling shadows. However, the past still haunted me from time to time. Sometimes, in the silence of the early morning, I could still hear that childish whisper, "Come play with me," echoing in my mind, a permanent reminder of the terror we lived in that cursed house. The nights in my small apartment were always the same. Silent, filled with medical books scattered everywhere, and the cold glow of the desk lamp illuminating my notes. The pressure of final exams kept me awake until the early hours, my heart pounding with each page I turned. Laura, a young medical student, that was my name. The routine was intense, and the university library had become an extension of my home. Studying in the tranquility of the night was a necessity, an almost sacred ritual. The building where I lived was old, with walls that kept stories of the many tenants who passed through there. The creaking of stairs and the distant sounds of doors closing were part of the scene, sounds I already knew and ignored. However, on that particular night, a different sound cut through the silence. My phone rang. I looked at the clock. It was almost 2 in the morning. Who could be calling me at this hour? With a mix of curiosity and concern, I answered. Hello? My voice sounded hesitant. On the other end of the line, just heavy breathing. I remained silent, waiting for a response, but nothing came but that unsettling sound. I hung up, trying to convince myself that it could have been a mistake or a bad joke. However, the discomfort remained. In the days that followed, the phone calls became a macabre routine. Always in the middle of the night, always with that oppressive breathing on the other side. I was beginning to feel like my privacy was being violated in ways I couldn't understand. Fear began to infiltrate my nights, turning the silence I cherished into a constant enemy. I decided to ignore it and focus on my studies, but the discomfort was difficult to dispel. One night, after a long day at the library, I came home more exhausted than ever. I walked slowly up the stairs, wanting to just fall into bed and forget about the world for a few hours. When I reached the door of my apartment, something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, although I was sure I had locked it before leaving. My heart raced, and a feeling of panic began to wash over me. I pushed the door carefully, trying not to make any noise. I entered the room, and the first thing I noticed was the disorder. Books scattered, cushions out of place, small objects moved. Nothing looked like it had been stolen, but the fact that someone had been there, going through my things, was disturbing. I spent the rest of the night awake, with all the lights on, trying to understand what was happening. Who could have entered my apartment? It's because the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming, and the thought of being watched every moment began to consume my mind. The phone rang again that night, and I didn't have the courage to answer it. Heavy breathing now echoed in my head, like a constant reminder that something or someone was watching me closely. The next few days were a chaotic mix of paranoia and exhaustion. My grades began to reflect my mental state, and concentrating on my studies became increasingly difficult. Every sound in the building seemed amplified. Every suspicious movement made me tense. I knew I couldn't go on like this for long. The morning after the unlocked door incident, I decided I needed to do something. First, I called the building management and asked them to check the security cameras. However, I was informed that the cameras had been out of service for months due to a technical fault that had not yet been fixed. I felt a growing despair, as if I were completely unprotected and without resources. The phone calls continued, and now, in addition to heavy breathing, I started receiving text messages. The first message I received said, "I'm watching you." My breath caught in my throat, and the anguish turned into absolute terror. It was no longer possible to ignore or try to rationalize what was happening. Someone was really chasing me. I decided to ask my friend for help, John, who was a technology and security enthusiast. I told him everything that was happening, from the phone calls to the break-in at my apartment and the disturbing messages. He was visibly concerned and immediately suggested installing a hidden camera in the living room, hoping to capture any suspicious activity while I was gone. Installing the camera brought a little relief, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I continued my routine as best I could, divided between the library and the apartment, but always with a knot in my stomach. Each time he returned home, he checked every corner, every shadow, with increasing dread. One night, while reviewing camera recordings with John, we finally found something. There he was, the intruder, a man of medium height, wearing a cap that obscured part of his face, entered my apartment with disturbing calm. He moved with familiarity, touching my belongings, moving objects around. It seemed like a ritual, a way of marking territory. The images were clear, but the man's identity remained a mystery. The panic I felt when I saw him invading my space made me make a drastic decision. I could no longer go back to that apartment alone. I called the police, who sent a team to investigate, but when they arrived, the intruder had already disappeared, and once again, there were no clear signs of forced entry. The police suggested changing the locks, but that didn't bring me any real security. Whoever it was, he had a key or some method of getting in without leaving a trace. The nights that followed were terrible. I could barely sleep, even though I knew John he was there, trying to protect me. Every crack, every shadow on the wall made me jump in fear. The days dragged on and the tension increased. The silent terror of being persecuted in my own home was unbearable. Then, on a particularly dark night, we encountered something that terrified us. Upon reviewing the most recent recordings, we saw the intruder enter again. This time, he left a message written in lipstick on the living room mirror. "You can't hide from me." The terror reached a new level. He knew I was trying to protect myself. He knew I was being filmed, and yet he didn't show fear. It seemed like a direct threat, a provocation. John decided we couldn't wait any longer. He would stay in the apartment with me that night, ready to face the intruder face to face if necessary. The tension in the air was palpable as we waited in the dark, ready for confrontation. I hid in my room, my heart beating so hard it seemed to echo off the walls. John the First was in the room on alert, waiting for the moment to act. And then, the door creaked slowly, announcing the arrival of the terror that haunted us. The tension in the air was suffocating as I hid in my room, my heart beating so hard it seemed to echo off the walls. John the First was in the room on alert, waiting for the moment to act. And then, the door creaked slowly, announcing the arrival of the terror that haunted us. The image of the intruder entering the apartment, captured on camera, did not do justice to the reality of the moment. He moved with an unsettling confidence, as if he had every right to be there. When he entered the room, John, hiding in the shadows, held his breath. The man began searching again, this time with a more sinister purpose. His presence was almost otherworldly, a living manifestation of the fear I had felt for weeks. John, he waited until the intruder's back was turned. With a quick and silent movement, he advanced, grabbing the man by the shoulders and pinning him to the ground. The intruder fought, but John managed to keep him under control until the police arrived, who had already been on their way since we raised the silent alarm. When the police finally entered, the tension exploded into a controlled frenzy of shouts and orders. The intruder was handcuffed and taken to the police station. Meanwhile, I came out of my hiding place, shaking and in shock. Seeing the intruder up close filled me with a mixture of fear and relief. He looked ordinary, but his eyes revealed a deep disturbance. At the police station, the intruder's true identity was revealed. He was a former tenant of the building, who had been evicted due to mental and behavioral problems. During his time at the apartment, he had copied the key and maintained secret access to the place. His obsession had grown over time, until he began observing and invading the space of new residents, including me. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the scars of terror were still present. Returned to the apartment, even with John next to me, it was an unbearable idea. The sight of the message in the mirror, the memory of the phone calls, and the constant intrusion made the place unbearable for me. I decided I needed to start over somewhere else. I found a new apartment in a building with tight security and working surveillance cameras. Most importantly, I decided to share a place with a classmate, Maria, so I would never feel so vulnerable and alone again. His presence brought a comfort I didn't know I needed. The first few days in the new apartment were strange, but little by little I began to feel relief. Maria's constant presence, the security measures, everything helped to rebuild my sense of security. Talking to her about what happened was also therapeutic, and together we developed a routine that allowed me to refocus on my studies and daily tasks. Over time, memories of the terror began to fade. I went back to focusing on my exams and rebuilding my life. Although the experience left scars, it also taught me the importance of vigilance and personal safety. I was determined to never leave my safety to chance again. So life took its course. The intruder was convicted and committed to an institution for treatment. The shadow of fear was replaced by the light of a new life, where I could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing I was safe. And that's how, with the support of friends and renewed determination, I managed to overcome the nightmare and build a new reality, where terror no longer had a place. The city streets were almost deserted when I arrived at my apartment, exhausted after a long shift at the hospital. It was always like this. The city lights contrasted with the stillness of my little refuge downtown. The work as a nurse was not easy, and the exhausting routine often made me feel like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. As I closed the door behind me, a familiar relief took over. The silence of the apartment, although welcome, also brought with it a strange feeling of isolation. After a quick shower and a light dinner, I threw myself into bed, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before my next shift. The clock said almost 3 in the morning when I finally managed to close my eyes. However, their rest was abruptly interrupted by a loud and unexpected sound. A slamming door. I sat up in bed, senses heightened by adrenaline. The sound came from the hallway, and my first thought was that maybe it was the wind. Living in the city center meant living with constant noise, and with the windows poorly sealed, the wind could easily cause these noises. I tried to ignore it, going back to bed, but the sounds continued. Now there were footsteps, slow and heavy, as if someone were walking down the hallway. Anxiety started to take over me. I got up and went to the door, putting my ear to the wood to try to hear better. The hallway was silent, with no signs of movement. I decided I was probably imagining things due to extreme tiredness. I locked the door with the extra deadbolt and went back to bed, forcing myself to believe that everything was fine. However, that night marked the beginning of a series of disturbing events. Early mornings became a stage for unsettling sounds, slamming doors and footsteps that seemed to roam the hallway outside my apartment. Every morning, I woke up with the feeling that something wasn't right, a constant restlessness that accompanied me throughout the day. Then, a frightening detail began to catch my attention. The front door was always slightly open, a small crack that I was sure I hadn't left. Mornings were the worst. Waking up and seeing the door ajar sent chills down my spine. I started locking the door more carefully, checking it several times before going to sleep, but nothing seemed to help. Additionally, I noticed that some of my belongings were out of place. My keys, always hanging on the hook next to the door, sometimes appeared on the kitchen table. My bag, which I used to leave on the couch, was found on the floor. It was like someone was coming in and going through my things. Fatigue and fear began to affect my work. I was constantly distracted, making mistakes I would never make under normal conditions. Colleagues noticed my change in behavior, but I didn't want to worry them with something that felt so surreal. I began to consider the possibility that I was being paranoid, but the events were too real to be just a figment of my imagination. One night, after a particularly difficult shift, I decided to take a relaxing bath to try and ease the tension. I let the hot water run over me, trying to wash away the anxiety. I was starting to relax when I heard a sound that made me freeze. Someone was trying to open the bathroom door. My heart raced. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what was happening. Someone was inside my apartment. I got out of the shower hurriedly, putting on my robe and grabbing the closest object that could serve as a weapon, a hairbrush. I opened the bathroom door slowly, and the apartment was silent. Then I saw the shadow. He passed through the living room quickly, an indistinct figure disappearing into the darkness. I ran to the front door, which was once again ajar. I closed it tightly, locking all the locks and placing a chair against the handle. The fear was now real and palpable. Someone had a copy of my key and was entering my apartment regularly. Each night, the anxiety grew, and the idea of being watched became unbearable. I decided I needed to do something, take steps to protect myself, and so I began planning how to catch the intruder in the act. The following nights were a mixture of anxiety and constant vigilance. I could barely sleep, always alert, waiting for the next sign of an invasion. Every little sound turned into a potential sign of danger, and the simple act of relaxing became impossible. The constant feeling of being watched, of having my space violated, was slowly consuming me. The morning after the bathroom incident, I woke up once again to find the front door slightly open. My heart sank, and fear gave way to silent anger. I decided to take more drastic measures. I asked my boss for a few days off, citing personal problems, and I dedicated myself to strengthening the security of the apartment. I changed the lock, added additional locks, and even a security bar on the door. However, the feeling of vulnerability persisted. In addition to the locks, I took another measure. I bought a hidden camera and installed it in the living room, positioned so as to capture the entire entrance to the apartment. The camera was small, unobtrusive, and I hoped it might finally capture some evidence of the intruder. I spent hours adjusting it, making sure it couldn't be seen easily. The idea was simple. If someone came in again, I would have concrete proof. The following nights were spent in a state of constant wakefulness. Each morning, the door was ajar and objects were out of place. The camera recordings showed nothing, as if the intruder knew exactly where not to step. I was beginning to doubt my sanity, wondering if this was all just the result of my exhausted mind. Then one night, something changed. I was taking a shower, as usual, trying to relax, when I heard the sound of someone trying to open the bathroom door again. This time, I was prepared. I quickly got out of the shower, turned off the bathroom lights, and sat in silence, waiting. I heard light footsteps outside, careful movements. My heart was beating fast, and every second felt like an eternity. I left the bathroom slowly, peeking through the crack in the door. The room was dark, but the moonlight cast shadows through the windows. And then I saw it. A shadow passed through the living room, moving silently towards the bedroom. The intruder was there, inside my apartment again. My breath caught in my throat, and cold fear coursed through my body. I closed the bathroom door slowly and went back to my improvised hiding place, behind a piece of furniture in the living room. I was determined to catch the intruder in the act, to end this nightmare. I took out my cell phone and, with shaking hands, called the police, whispering a cry for help. The wait was agonizing. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and the sounds in the room indicated that the intruder was rummaging through my things again. My heart hammered in my chest as I waited for the police to arrive. And then, I heard the front door open. The figure entered silently, moving with frightening familiarity. I silently approached the intruder, who had his back to me, focused on rummaging through my bag on the table. With a quick movement, I activated the pepper spray I had purchased days before. The intruder screamed, holding his face in his hands as I quickly backed away, keeping the spray pointed at him. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain. I ran to the front door, waiting for the police to arrive, who eventually entered and quickly restrained the man. The intruder was led away in handcuffs, and I watched as he was led out of the building. Feeling the cold, early morning breeze on my face brought a feeling of relief, but also of fragility. I was exhausted, emotionally worn out, but I knew this was the end of a terrible chapter. At the police station, the intruder's true identity was revealed. It was my upstairs neighbor, a man I barely knew. He had developed an obsession with me, copying my apartment key and regularly breaking in while I was gone. The police found a collection of my personal effects in his apartment, small items he had taken over time. His unhealthy fixation had turned my life into a nightmare. I decided I couldn't continue living there. The feeling of violation was unbearable. I found a new apartment in a building with tight security and active surveillance cameras. This time, I took every possible precaution. I changed the locks, installed an internal surveillance system, and most importantly, I decided to share the apartment with a coworker, Sarah. Sarah brought a sense of security and companionship that I didn't know I needed. Little by little, the feeling of fear subsided, replaced by the normality of a shared routine. The scars from that experience were still there, but with the support of friends and a fresh start, I began to feel safe again. And so, with reinforced security measures and the company of a trustworthy friend, I managed to leave the nightmare behind. Life went on, and I learned to value the importance of safety and vigilance. I would never underestimate the warning signs again, and I was determined to never again leave my safety to chance. It was a sweltering summer night, and the house was as hot as an oven. I, Kevin, a freelance programmer, was trying to concentrate on work, but the heat wave made any coherent thought impossible. In a desperate attempt to get some relief, I decided to open all the windows. The night breeze, although warm, promised some refreshment. As the night progressed, an uneasy silence took over the house. The open windows allowed sounds from outside to invade the room. I started to hear strange noises coming from the garden. First, it was a light rustling sound, then a sharp crack that echoed through the house. It must just be an animal, I thought, trying to calm myself. I got up from the chair and went to the window, looking at the dimly lit garden. The wind made the leaves of the trees dance, but there was no sign of any creature. However, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow inside me, as if I was being watched. I went back inside, closed the window, and tried to get back to work, but the restlessness wouldn't leave me. I felt the eyes of something or someone following me in the darkness. With each new sound, my curiosity and anxiety increased. I decided to grab a flashlight and check the garden more closely. I walked to the lawn, illuminating every corner with the beam of light. The shadows moved suspiciously, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. Satisfied that nothing was wrong, I went back inside, trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. Little did I know that this feeling of being watched would only be the beginning of a sequence of terrifying events. The following nights were marked by an increase in the strangeness of events. Each morning, I woke up with the distinct impression that something was out of place. The tools in the garden seemed to be moving on their own. The watering can, which I always left near the plants, appeared in the middle of the lawn, and the garden furniture, which I carefully aligned, was always in disarray. One afternoon, as I went out to check the yard, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Footprints. They weren't mine, nor did they look like the brands of shoes I wore. The footprints were larger and deeper, indicating that a heavier person had been walking there. My heart accelerated. Who was coming into my garden at night? I started looking more closely, and it didn't take long to realize that someone was going through my belongings in the garage too. Tools that I knew exactly where were kept appeared in different places. Even the toolbox looked like it had been rummaged through. I decided I needed to take some action. I decided to monitor the garage at night, hoping to catch the intruder in the act. One moonless night, I sat in a dark corner of the living room, where I had a good view of the garage through a small window. The clock struck just after midnight when I saw a hooded figure approach silently. The stranger tried to pick the lock on the garage door, and my heart skipped a beat. It was now or never. Without making a sound, I went out the back door and walked around the house. I approached the garage carefully and, in one quick movement, managed to lock the figure inside. I called the police immediately, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. When they arrived and opened the garage, we found clear evidence that someone had been there recently. A flashlight, some open cans of food, and an old blanket, but no person. The police couldn't do much other than advise me to tighten security. I stayed awake all night, feeling like the darkness around me hid secrets I didn't want to reveal. It was clear that someone or something had made my home their refuge. The feeling of being watched, which I had initially dismissed as paranoia, was now confirmed as a real and palpable threat. Determined to find out what was going on, I decided to investigate the garage more carefully during the day. I started going through all the shelves and boxes, looking for any evidence that might have escaped police inspection. Behind a shelf full of old tools, I noticed something peculiar. A wooden wall with scratch marks, as if it had been pushed repeatedly. With effort, I moved the shelf, revealing a small hidden space behind it. My flashlight illuminated the interior, and I was horrified by what I saw. There was a kind of improvised hiding place. Leftover food, a few bottles of water, and even an old sleeping bag were piled in the corner. On the floor, I spotted an old, worn-out wallet, which looked like it had been left behind in a hurry. It contained personal documents and family photos, revealing the identity of my intruder, a homeless man who had turned my garage into his refuge. My blood ran cold when I heard a soft crack behind me. I turned slowly, feeling a presence in the room. I faced the intruder, a man with a haggard appearance and desperate eyes, who was trying to escape. His movements were fast, but fear and adrenaline gave me the strength to hold him back. I fought with him, holding his arm until I could restrain him. My hands shook as I called the police again. When officers arrived, they detained the man and identified him as someone who had been missing for months, living on the streets and breaking into homes to survive. The expression of relief mixed with despair on the intruder's face caused a lump in my throat. He was not a mortal threat, but a man broken by life's circumstances. With the intruder taken away by the police, my house finally seemed peaceful. However, the sense of security had been irreparably shaken. I decided it was time to take drastic action. I installed security cameras at all strategic points and made sure all windows and doors were locked and reinforced. Although the summer heat continued, I kept the windows closed, relying solely on the air conditioning to keep the house cool. Every time I passed the garage, I was reminded of the secret hiding place and the man who had lived there, invisible for so long. The experience left a deep mark on me. The tranquility of my routine as a freelance programmer had been interrupted by a dark reality that I would never have imagined. Fear still haunted my mind at night, but now it was accompanied by an acute awareness of the fragility of life and the invisible barriers that separate us from others. And so, I learned to live with the feeling of being watched, not by a mysterious intruder, but by the ghosts of an experience that taught me never to underestimate what might be lurking in the darkness. I've never been one to scare easily. I have always been rational, someone who found comfort in logic and exact sciences. After all, I am an engineering student. But that night, the loneliness of my apartment felt more oppressive than ever. My roommates had gone out of town for a long vacation, leaving me alone. The apartment, normally full of conversation and laughter, was enveloped in an almost palpable silence. The only sound was the distant murmur of traffic, which seemed more muffled than usual. Sitting at my study table, I tried to concentrate on the calculations and diagrams, but my mind constantly wandered. So I heard it for the first time, a low, continuous sound coming from the plumbing. Felt like scraping, as if something was scratching the walls of the pipes. I frowned, trying to understand what could be causing this. Maybe it was just a common maintenance issue, something that could be easily resolved. I decided I would deal with it the next day by turning my attention to my studies. But even as I tried to sleep, the sound seemed to follow me. The repetitive and persistent noise invaded my dreams, turning them into unsettling nightmares. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find a comfortable position, my mind buzzing with worry. Finally, tiredness overcame me and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning to sunlight filtering through the curtains, feeling exhausted and anxious. I decided to check the bathroom. I opened the door slowly, as if expecting to find something unusual, but everything seemed normal. Water ran from the taps, the toilet worked properly, and there were no obvious signs of plumbing problems. I took a deep breath, relieved. Maybe it was just my imagination, exacerbated by the loneliness and silence of the night. However, as the day progressed, I started to notice a strange smell coming from the bathroom. It was a subtle odor at first, but it soon became impossible to ignore. It was a rotten smell, as if something was rotting in there. I did my best to ignore it, but the smell only got worse. And to my frustration, I noticed that the water was draining more slowly. The drain seemed clogged. With a sigh of resignation, I decided to call a plumber. I called the maintenance company, explaining the situation, and they promised to send someone as soon as possible. As I waited, the smell became increasingly unbearable. I paced around the apartment, trying to distract my mind with household chores, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Finally, the plumber arrived, a middle-aged man with a professional countenance, carrying his toolbox. I explained the problem and he started working. I watched anxiously as he dismantled part of the plumbing. Soon, the expression on his face changed from curiosity to perplexity. He found a series of dirty rags and food debris clogging the pipes, something that didn't make sense for a clean apartment like ours. "That's very strange," he said, shaking his head. That statement resonated in my mind. The plumber cleaned the pipes and the smell finally started to dissipate. The water drained normally again, and he assured me that the problem was resolved. I thanked him and followed him to the door, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. That night, I sat up in bed, trying to relax. The apartment was silent again, but now it felt heavy, oppressive. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts, but soon I started hearing again. This time, it wasn't a sound coming from the plumbing. It was a distinct sound of footsteps coming from the bathroom's false ceiling. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were walking overhead. I stood up slowly, feeling a chill down my spine. I knew I needed to investigate, but fear paralyzed me. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage. With cautious steps, I walked to the bathroom. The dim light from the hallway illuminated the room, but the false ceiling seemed to hide dark secrets. I took a ladder and, with shaking hands, began to climb it. I opened the small door to the false ceiling and a musty smell invaded my nostrils. As I shined a flashlight into the space, my heart nearly stopped. There was a small space with blankets and supplies. Someone was living there. I went down quickly, with my heart racing and my mind in a panic. Someone was hiding in my apartment, and I had no idea who or for how long. I came down from the stairs with my heart hammering in my chest, my legs shaking. The revelation that someone was living in my bathroom's false ceiling left me in a state of shock. How was this possible? How long was this person there, observing my routine, listening to my movements? I tried to calm my mind, but the fear and restlessness were overwhelming. I went back to my room and locked the door, feeling a little safer. I sat up in bed and picked up my cell phone, considering calling the police immediately. But what would I say? Hello? Is someone living under my roof? Felt surreal. I decided I needed more information before making any decisions. I spent the next day on high alert, every little sound making my heart skip a beat. I avoided the bathroom as much as possible, using my neighbors whenever I could. My hands were sweaty and my mind was spinning in circles, wondering who could be up there and what they wanted. At night, the apartment was silent again. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with the television, when an unpleasant smell began to invade the room. The odor was familiar, reminiscent of the putrid smell that came from the bathroom before the plumber's visit. Now it seemed to be spread throughout the apartment. I got up and started following the scent. He seemed to come from the bathroom again. With a knot in my stomach, I opened the door. The odor was unbearable. The bathroom was empty, but the false ceiling looked more menacing than ever. I needed to do something. I couldn't continue living with that invisible terror hanging over me. I called the plumber again, asking him to come back and check the pipes one more time. He arrived the next day, seeming surprised that I had called again. I explained that the smell had returned and that I suspected more obstructions. He got to work, dismantling parts of the plumbing and investigating every corner. While he worked, I sat on the couch trying to control my anxiety. The smell got worse as he went, but he found no more rags or food scraps. It looked like the pipes were clean. The plumber, visibly confused, raised his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "There's nothing more I can do here," he said. I thanked him and followed him to the door, feeling even more lost. The smell didn't make sense, nor did the presence of someone in the false ceiling. I sat in the room, trying to think of a solution, when I heard it again. Steps, slowly crawling across the ceiling, as if the person was trying to move without being detected. I grabbed a flashlight, my courage mixed with desperation. I decided I needed to confront whatever was going on there. I climbed the stairs and opened the small false ceiling door again. This time, as I illuminated the space, I saw more than before. There were clothes, sleeping bags, and some cans of food. It was an improvised hiding place. I quickly went downstairs and returned to my room, trying to figure out what I should do next. That night, I could barely sleep. The persistent sounds of footsteps and movement in the false ceiling kept me awake, each noise increasing my fear and anxiety. The next morning, I decided I could no longer put off solving the problem. I called the police and reported what I had found. They arrived quickly, and I led them to the bathroom, explaining everything I knew. The police climbed onto the false ceiling and, after a few minutes of investigation, came down with a malnourished and visibly disturbed man. He was dirty and wide-eyed with fear and confusion. The police took him away, and they explained to me that he was a former resident of the building, evicted months before. With nowhere to go, he found refuge in the false ceiling of my apartment. I was shocked and at the same time relieved that he wasn't a violent threat, but the experience left a deep mark on me. I spent the next few days reinforcing the security of the apartment. I installed extra locks on the doors and windows and talked to my roommates about the situation. We all agreed that we should be more vigilant from then on. Even after strengthening the security of the apartment, the feeling of vulnerability persisted. My roommates came back and I explained everything that had happened. They were as shocked as I was, but tried to reassure me that we were safer now. Despite this, I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound at night made my heart race, bringing back the fear and anxiety. It seemed that the shadows became thicker and the night noises more menacing. I decided I needed to do something more drastic to regain my peace of mind. I spoke to a close friend, explaining the whole situation. He offered me to stay in his apartment for a while until I felt safe again. I accepted immediately. I packed my things and temporarily moved into his apartment, where the presence of a known and trustworthy person helped calm my nerves. The first few days were difficult. Even far from my apartment, the memories of those nights of terror were still fresh in my mind. I would wake up with a start, in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone was watching me. But little by little, normality began to return. My friend's constant presence and the familiar routine helped me regain the sense of security I had lost. Meanwhile, my roommates tightened the security of our apartment even further. They installed surveillance cameras and motion sensors, ensuring that any future intrusions would be quickly detected. We also went to the building administration and reported what happened, demanding more security and maintenance. After a few weeks, I started to feel more confident. The nights were less scary and the nightmares began to lessen. I decided it was time to go back to my apartment. I packed my things again and thanked my friend for his hospitality. Upon entering my apartment, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. My roommates welcomed me with open arms, and together, we reaffirmed our commitment to keeping the place safe. Surveillance cameras and new locks helped bring a sense of security, but most important was the mutual support we found in each other. Over time, life returned to normal. The false ceiling incident became a story we told friends, a grim reminder of how elusive safety can be. But it was also a lesson in resilience and the importance of being aware and prepared. Even today, when I'm alone at night, I sometimes hear noises that remind me of those terrifying moments. But instead of being consumed by fear, I use these memories as a reminder that safety is not guaranteed and that vigilance is essential. And, above all, that I am never truly alone as long as I have friends and allies by my side. This experience changed my life, making me more cautious and aware of the invisible dangers that may be lurking. And although the fear never completely disappears, I have learned to face it with courage and determination, turning the terror of the unknown into a force for continued vigilance and safety. After a long and exhausting day at the restaurant, I finally arrived home. Working as a chef was a dream come true, but the endless hours in the kitchen, the heat and constant pressure made each journey a true test of endurance. All I wanted now was a hot shower, something quick to eat, and some peace before bed. As I prepared to relax, the doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I went to the door, intrigued, as I hadn't expected any visitors nor had I ordered food. When I opened it, a middle-aged delivery man was standing there, holding a large brown paper bag. He handed me the food, mentioning an order in the name Ben. Even though I didn't remember making the request, I accepted, thinking that maybe it was a gift or a happy mistake. I closed the door, but before I could take more than a few steps, a shiver ran down my spine. I looked out the front window and saw a man standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows. He did nothing but watch my house with a fixed, unsettling gaze. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort, and decided to ignore him. After all, it could just be a curious neighbor or someone waiting for a taxi. As the night wore on, I tried to distract myself with a TV show, but my thoughts kept returning to the stranger across the street. I went to the window again, and there he was, motionless, still watching. Anxiety started to set in, but I forced myself to believe it was no big deal. Shortly after, I heard a noise coming from the back door. It looked like someone was trying to force entry. My heart raced. I ran to the kitchen, turning off all the lights on the way. When I got to the back window, I could see the same man, now trying to break down my door. I turned off the last light and hid behind the kitchen counter, leaving only a small gap to observe. My thoughts were racing. Who was this man? What did he want? I grabbed my cell phone and, with shaking hands, called the police, leaving the line open in hopes that they would trace the call and come quickly. Time seemed to drag by. I heard the sound of the back door giving way, followed by slow, cautious footsteps inside the house. The intruder was there. My palms were sweaty and my heart was beating so hard I was afraid he might hear it. I could see the man's feet as he searched the rooms, opening doors and drawers, looking for something. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He approached the kitchen, each step increasing my panic. So, in a moment of desperation, I grabbed a knife from the drawer next to me, trying to prepare myself for the worst. The kitchen door slowly opened. The man entered, his eyes scanning the darkness until he found me. Without thinking, I advanced with the knife in my hand. He reacted quickly, and an intense and desperate fight began. We both fell to the ground, the knife slipping from my hands. I was exhausted and desperate when I heard sirens in the distance. The police arrived at just the right moment, breaking down the front door and immobilizing the intruder. He was taken away in handcuffs, while I stood there, panting and in shock. After everything, I sat in the kitchen, trying to process what had happened. I thanked the police, who assured me that the man would be arrested and that I would be safe. However, I knew something needed to change. Over the next few days, I reinforced all the locks and installed security cameras around the entire house. Additionally, I signed up for a self-defense course so I would never be caught unprepared again. I shared my experience on social media, warning friends and neighbors about the importance of home safety. Life slowly returned to normal, but that incident changed me forever. I learned to always be alert and never underestimate the danger that can lurk, even in the most familiar places. That week of vacation had started as I had hoped, peaceful and secluded in my summer retreat, a cozy old wooden cottage in the middle of the countryside. After a long and exhausting semester at university, where I taught history, all I needed was peace of mind. The days passed lazily, and I dedicated myself to reading, walking through the woods and simply enjoying the serenity that nature offered. On that particular night, the sky was especially clear, revealing a starry blanket of mesmerizing beauty. The wind was blowing gently, whispering through the trees, and I felt at peace, completely disconnected from the world outside. After dinner, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, lost in my thoughts. It was then that the phone rang, an unexpected sound that broke the tranquility of the night. I looked at the display and saw an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, but ended up answering. "Hello." The response was absolute silence. After a few seconds, the line went dead. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a mistake. I put the phone aside and turned my attention to the night sky, trying to regain a sense of calm. Minutes later, the sound of an engine caught my attention. A car was approaching on the dirt road that led to the cabin. I was tense, my heart was racing. The car stopped in front of my house, and the headlights stayed on, illuminating the main entrance. My survival instinct kicked in immediately. Something was wrong. I got up slowly and went to the living room window. I looked through the curtains and saw the vehicle parked at a strategic point where all access to the chalet could be monitored. I tried to identify who was inside, but the headlights obscured my vision. The darkness around made it seem like the car's light was even more intense, as if it were an insurmountable barrier. My mind raced, searching for logical explanations, but the growing discomfort told me that I needed to act. I turned off all the lights in the house, trying to become invisible. Then I headed to the basement, the safest place I could think of at that moment. I closed the door behind me and sat on the cold floor, trying to control my breathing as I waited for the car to drive away. The basement was dark and damp, with a musty smell that intensified as the minutes passed. I could hear my heart beating, each beat echoing in the oppressive stillness around me. Trying not to make any noise, I moved slowly to a corner where I knew my grandfather had stored some old things, including an old lantern. I felt around in the dark until I found it, but I hesitated to turn it on, worried that the light might attract unwanted attention. From the basement, I could barely hear the sounds outside, but after a few minutes, the silence was broken by footsteps. Someone was walking around the house, and the distinct sound of footsteps on gravel made my blood run cold. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but terror was beginning to take over me. They were checking all the windows and doors, as if they were looking for a way in. Desperate, I grabbed my cell phone. I needed to call the police. With trembling fingers, I dialed the emergency number, but before I could complete the call, the battery died, leaving me without communication. I stared at the blank screen with an overwhelming feeling of helplessness. I was alone. The darkness seemed thicker around me as the footsteps continued. I felt a wave of panic, but I knew I needed to be rational. I remembered that my grandfather, a war veteran, had an old shotgun stored somewhere in the basement. I never thought I would have to use it, but that night, there was no other option. I crawled to the far corner of the basement, where I found the rusty chest that contained the gun. The lid creaked open, and I prayed no one had heard. Inside, under a pile of old rags, was the shotgun. Trembling, I took it out and made sure it was charged, something my grandfather had taught me years ago. Luckily, it was ready to use. The footsteps approached one of the windows, and I heard the sound of glass breaking. They had managed to get in. My mind raced, and I gripped the shotgun tightly, pointing it at the stairs leading to the basement. The flashlight, still off, was next to me, ready to be used if necessary. The sound of footsteps coming down the stairs was becoming clearer and clearer. Every creak of the steps sounded like thunder in my ears. I knew I was about to confront the unknown. So, in a surge of courage mixed with desperation, I turned on the flashlight, illuminating the stairs and revealing the shadowy figure descending. In a quick movement, I raised the rifle and fired a warning shot. The deafening noise echoed through the basement, and the figure immediately stopped. I could hear murmurs and hurried footsteps heading back up the stairs. The silence returned, heavy and threatening, but this time, the intruders retreated. I waited, motionless, each second dragging like an eternity. The silence in the basement was palpable, as if the world had stopped for a moment. My hands shook, gripping the shotgun tightly as adrenaline pulsed through my veins. I could barely breathe, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint that the intruders were still nearby. Endless minutes passed, but no sound came from upstairs. Finally, I gathered the courage to climb the stairs, keeping the shotgun ready for any eventuality. The flashlight illuminated my path as I moved through the darkness, each shadow seeming to twist with menace. Upon reaching the ground floor, I noticed that the house was silent. The intruders were gone. A sigh of relief escaped my lips, but the tension was still present. Couldn't let my guard down. I went to the broken window, looking at the wreckage on the floor. Fear still pulsed through my veins, but determination took its place. I picked up the landline and dialed the police, reporting what had happened. They promised to send a vehicle immediately. While I waited, I searched the house for any sign of the intruders. There wasn't much to find except for the broken window and some footprints in the grass outside. I grabbed the shotgun and prepared to hand it over to the authorities when they arrived. Finally, the lights of a flashing police car cut through the darkness of the night. The police entered my house, listening to my story carefully. They promised to do everything possible to find those responsible, but advised me to stay alert and take additional precautions. After the police left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was safe, at least for now, but the fear was still there, a constant shadow hanging over me. I decided I would never feel so vulnerable again. I installed an advanced security system in the house and contacted my neighbors, establishing a mutual support network. Together, we promised to remain vigilant and protect each other from any threat that might arise. And so, as night gave way to dawn, I sat on the cabin porch, looking out at the horizon with a mix of gratitude and determination. I survived that night of terror, and nothing would stop me from protecting my refuge from the shadows that lurked in the darkness. I have always loved the tranquility of the countryside, the isolation, the peace that only the silence of nature could provide. As a photographer, inspiration flowed freely in these environments, far from the urban chaos. I bought an isolated house in the hills, surrounded by dense forest, where I could dedicate myself to my work without interruption. During the day, I captured the natural beauty around me. At night, I edited my photos in my little makeshift studio. On that particular night, the sky was clear and the full moon illuminated the landscape with a silvery light. I was focused on editing some photos I had taken earlier, lost in the glow of my laptop screen. It was a routine I loved, a routine I never imagined could be disrupted in such a disruptive way. As I worked, I was suddenly snapped out of my concentration by a distinct sound of branches breaking, followed by heavy footsteps outside. I froze for a moment, listening intently. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, a deer, or maybe a rabbit, but the sequence of sounds was undeniably human. Curious and apprehensive, I got up from my chair and went to the living room window, opening the curtain slightly. His heart began to beat faster when he glimpsed a shadow moving quickly between the trees. The figure looked human, but it was too far away for me to make out any details. Fear began to creep in, a strange, uncomfortable feeling, but I decided I must be imagining things. I went back to my work, trying to calm down, but the peace didn't last long. More noises came, closer this time, breaking the fragile veil of security I was trying to maintain. Panic began to rise in me, an inevitable tide of anxiety. That night, the tranquility I loved so much turned into something oppressive and sinister. My mind was on high alert. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I stood up again, this time more determined to understand what was happening. I went to the front door and made sure it was locked. Every lock, every window, they were all properly protected. But still, the feeling of danger did not lessen. When I returned to the living room, I noticed something that made me freeze completely. The outside light, the one I always left on to illuminate the backyard at night, was off. That had never happened before. Could it be a coincidence? Or had someone deliberately turned off the light? The second possibility made my stomach turn with fear. I took a step toward the window again, and that's when I saw it. On the glass, printed as if they had been made recently, were large, smudged, dirty handprints. Every detail of the fingers was there, etched into the dirt outside. My heart raced, and my breathing became labored. I was being watched. Someone was there, leaning against my window, looking into my house while I was distracted. That vision made me run around the house, checking every window, every door, making sure everything was locked. I grabbed a heavy camera tripod, the closest thing I could use as a weapon, and went to my room where the feeling of security was a little greater. I locked the door and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, with the tripod firmly in my hands. Outside, the footsteps returned, this time clearer, closer. They circled the house, slowly and methodically, as if the person was looking for a way in. Trembling, I stood up enough to peer out the bedroom window. I saw a shadow pass quickly, the silhouette of a human figure obscured by the darkness but indisputably real. The figure stopped in front of the back door, and I heard the sound of someone trying to open the lock. Every second felt like an eternity. I knew the door was locked, but the fear that at any moment someone might be able to force it open was overwhelming. Desperate, I picked up the phone and called the police, explaining the situation and my location. The attendant's voice was calm and professional, but the answer was inevitable. It would take a while for someone to get to my house, due to the remote location. Desperate, my mind raced trying to think of something I could do. It was then that I remembered the car alarm. I grabbed the keys and, with shaking hands, pressed the panic button. The deafening sound of the alarm filled the night, cutting through the silence like a knife. I ran back to the window and saw the figure flee, disappearing into the forest as the sound echoed. It wasn't long before I heard police sirens approaching. But even when the police arrived and began searching the area, I knew that moment of terror would be etched in my memory forever. Officers searched the area around the house thoroughly but found no sign of the intruder. The sense of relief that came with their presence was brief and superficial. The reality that I was vulnerable in that isolated location set in deeply. They assured me that they would be patrolling the area overnight and asked that I keep all exterior lights on and doors locked. After the cops were gone, the house seemed quieter and more oppressive than ever. Despite their reassuring presence moments before, the memory of dirty handprints on the windows and footsteps around the house was still vivid in my mind. I decided not to sleep that night. Instead, I remained vigilant, with the tripod still at my side, ready for any eventuality. The next morning, daylight brought some comfort, but the fear of the night before still hung over me. I decided I needed to take drastic measures to ensure my safety. Installing a security system with cameras and motion sensors around the house was the priority. I went to the nearest city and bought the necessary equipment, also hiring a professional to install everything quickly. The presence of cameras and sensors brought a feeling of control, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to completely remove the fear. I called some friends and asked them to come stay with me for a few days. Fortunately, they understood the seriousness of the situation and came promptly. Having company at home was a welcome relief. The presence of other people helped to dispel the feeling of isolation. Over the next few days, my routine resumed slowly, but with a new awareness of my vulnerability. I continued to work on my photography projects, but with the constant reminder that I needed to be aware. The installed cameras gave me a comprehensive view of the perimeter of the house, and I checked them regularly. The incident made me realize that as much as I loved the tranquility of the countryside, safety could not be compromised. I relied on the support of my friends and took steps to ensure that if something like this happened again, I would be more prepared. Eventually, life returned to a kind of normalcy, but I never stopped being vigilant. The experience taught me to value safety and not to underestimate the dangers that can lurk, even in the most peaceful places. The tranquility I once cherished was replaced by a constant caution, a reminder that even in the serenity of the countryside, danger can lurk in the darkness of night. It was a quiet night on the outskirts, and I was alone at home. My wife was traveling for work, leaving me responsible for the house and my daily routine. As a young advertising executive, I was swamped with an important project that needed to be finished by the next morning. The night dragged on as I worked tirelessly in the living room, the light from the monitor being the only thing illuminating the space around me. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something strange with the internet. The connection was intermittent, oscillating between working and dropping completely. It was frustrating as I depended on a stable connection to access important files and send critical emails. After a few failed attempts to resolve the issue by restarting the modem and checking the cables, I realized something else was going on. I decided to check the router. To my surprise, all settings had been reset to factory defaults. I knew this couldn't have happened by chance. The first thing that came to mind was the possibility that someone was trying to access my Wi-Fi network. An uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. Could someone be trying to invade my privacy? Or worse, steal personal information? The tension began to build as I set up the router again, this time tightening security with a stronger password and activating all available security measures. But the feeling that something was wrong persisted. I needed to investigate further and find out if my suspicions were founded. Deciding to investigate further, I opened the router's control panel and began checking the devices connected to the network. My breath caught in my throat when I saw something that shouldn't be there. An unfamiliar laptop. The name of the device was unfamiliar to me, and it was definitely not something that belonged to me or my wife. Panic began to set in. Who could be using my network? It's because my thoughts started racing, imagining the possible intentions behind this. I quickly began tracking the signal from the unknown device. I focused on the details, trying to pinpoint the source of the connection. To my amazement, I realized that the signal was coming from a nearby point, on the street in front of my house. With my heart racing, I went to the living room window and looked outside, trying to find anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw a van parked on the other side of the street. It wasn't common to see strange vehicles around at that time of night. And even more suspicious was the fact that there were two people inside the van, clearly working with some electronic equipment. My first instinct was to turn off the router and cut off their access, but in doing so, I realized I would be left without any form of cyber protection. The house suddenly seemed vulnerable. I turned off all the lights, trying not to attract attention, and continued to observe the two individuals in the van. I felt a chill run down my spine every time I thought about what they could be trying to do with my personal information. It was then that I heard a sound coming from the basement. There were small clicks, as if someone was moving the equipment. My heart raced. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step heavier and slower than the last. In the darkness, I held a baseball bat that we kept for emergencies. Upon arriving at the basement, the scene I encountered made my blood run cold. A strange device was connected to the main router. As I tried to understand what the device was, I heard heavy footsteps outside, near the back door. Someone was trying to break into my house. The situation had escalated from a simple cyber intrusion to a real physical threat. I gripped the baseball bat tightly, my heart beating wildly. In the dark basement, the only light came from the blinking LEDs of the strange device plugged into my router. Every click and pop seemed to echo through the house, amplifying the fear that gripped me. The footsteps outside became more insistent, as if someone was forcing entry through the back door. I took a deep breath and cautiously moved towards the router. I needed to disconnect that device before it caused more damage. With shaking hands, I pulled on the cable, and the sound of the device shutting down was like a small relief amid the storm of tension. However, this did not resolve the immediate threat outside. As I walked back up the stairs, I heard the sound of something being forced against the back door. My senses were on high alert, every sound magnified by the fear pulsing through my veins. I went to the kitchen and picked up the phone, frantically dialing the police. I explained the situation, my voice shaking as I tried to remain calm. They told me to lock myself in a safe room and wait for a police car to arrive. I waited in the living room, keeping the baseball bat nearby. The sound of footsteps outside the house seemed closer and closer, as if they were circling the property, looking for a way in. I looked out the window and saw the van's lights still on, with the two figures inside fiddling with their equipment, oblivious to the fact that I had already called the authorities. It was an indescribable relief to hear the sound of sirens approaching. The blue and red lights reflected off the walls of the room, creating a surreal spectacle of safety amidst the chaos. Police quickly arrived and surrounded the van, detaining the two individuals before they had the chance to flee. The police entered my house, inspecting every corner to make sure it was safe. I explained about the strange device in the basement, and they confirmed that it was transmission equipment used to steal personal data. The criminals in the van were trying to access my financial information, an attack carefully planned to leave me vulnerable. Over the next few days, the incident left me deeply shaken. I decided to invest heavily in cybersecurity, hiring a specialized company to protect my data. In addition, we reinforced the physical security of the house, installing cameras and alarms at all entry points. The experience was a harsh reminder of how easily our privacy can be compromised and how vulnerable we are to technological and physical threats. But above all, it was a lesson in the importance of always being alert and prepared to protect what we value most. I was alone in my isolated country house, seeking inspiration for my next book. The remote location always seemed ideal for writing, far from the distractions of the city and surrounded by the tranquility of nature. That night, however, the peace was interrupted by a violent storm. The wind howled, and the rain drummed incessantly on the roof. The trees swayed menacingly, as if they were being thrown from one side to the other. When the electricity went out, plunging the house into darkness, my heart began to beat faster. I pulled out some candles and lanterns that I had saved for just such occasions, trying to remain calm as I lit each one, illuminating the house with flickering lights. It was then that, illuminated by lightning, I saw something that left me cold. Outside the window, a strange figure stood out against the darkness of the night. The light from the lightning revealed just a glimpse, a tall, indistinct silhouette that seemed to be watching me. In an impulse of panic, I blew out the candle closest to the window and backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Fear took over me. I quickly closed all the curtains and locked all the doors, trying to convince myself that I was safe. The house, once welcoming, now seemed like a maze of threatening shadows. I felt every creak and crack like a warning, every breath of wind like an ominous whisper. I desperately searched for some form of communication, reaching for my cell phone only to discover that the storm had knocked out the signal. My hands shook as I held the useless phone. I tried to think rationally, to remember all the horror stories I had ever read and written. This was just my imagination. But then, I heard the sound that chilled my blood. Soft knocks on the front door. The beats were soft at first, almost delicate, but each touch seemed to resonate directly with my nerves. With each beat, my anxiety increased. Who or what would be out there, in the middle of a storm, knocking on my door? I decided to explore the house for a landline, something I could use to call for help. I rummaged through drawers and looked in dark corners, but all I found were cut phone lines, wires dangling like mutilated limbs. The sound of wet footsteps echoed through the house. They were slow, shuffling, as if someone was walking with wet feet across the wooden floor. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself it was just storm water coming in, but I knew that wasn't true. There was someone in there with me. With my heart pounding in my throat, I ran to my room and locked the door. At the bottom of a closet, I found an old radio that still worked. With trembling fingers, I turned on the device and began turning the dial, desperately searching for an emergency frequency. As I tried to tune in to a station, the knocking on the front door intensified, becoming urgent, almost frantic. Panic gripped me, and I kept turning the dial, the static from the radio mixing with the sounds of the storm outside. Finally, the radio picked up a frequency. I almost cried with relief when I heard a distant voice, asking anyone in need of help to respond. With a trembling voice, I began to describe my situation, begging for help. On the other side, the person tried to calm me down, promising to send help immediately. However, before I could relax, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The bedroom doorknob was turning slowly. I looked at the door, eyes wide with fear, and there was the strange figure standing in the doorway. Illuminated by the dim light of the radio, I could see more details. It was a man, with soaked clothes and a blank expression in his eyes. He stared at me with frightening intensity. I screamed into the radio, begging for help as the figure slowly advanced towards me. Just as he approached, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. The intruder stopped, hesitated for a second, and then fled toward the darkness of the hallway. The police arrived a few minutes later, although it felt like hours. I guided them through the house, still shaking and in shock, but they found no sign of the intruder. After a thorough search, one of the officers informed me that they had received reports of a local resident who used to take advantage of storms to break into isolated houses. The next few days were a haze of panic and caution. I decided to install an emergency generator and an advanced security system. I also made a point of reinforcing all the doors and windows. The tranquility I once loved in my country home had been irrevocably tarnished by fear. Even today, when a storm approaches, I remember that terrible night. The image of the figure at the door, the feeling of helplessness and absolute terror, haunts me. However, it also taught me to never underestimate the importance of safety, even in the most peaceful of hideaways.